I'm Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
One of the most beautiful games I have ever played is the Bioshock series, a game that imbues thought-provoking philosophy, contentious themes, and an emotionally charged story with a gorgeous and believable world filled with meticulously complex characters. Immersing yourself is the most effortless thing to do here. Bioshock and its spiritual predecessor System Shock blows most other games out of the water in terms of really pushing and using the medium to tell the story in a way only games can. This type of game has firmly established to other developers in the industry that games like this can be a commercial success when done right. After each Bioshock, I would always obsess about my experiences in the games and feel a sense of yearning for more, almost like putting down a good book you finished or getting to the end of a film or show. With Bioshock the collection in my hands, I thought I should make a video on Bioshock. This video will critically analyze Bioshock 1 and Infinite, looking at its story, influences, themes, philosophies, and other salient points of the game, with a view to showing the greatness behind Bioshock 1 and Infinite. And by the way, we are skipping number 2 because Ken Levine was not involved in the second one, so therefore it is not really a Bioshock in my books. So let us take a nostalgic leap into this magnificent game and reminisce. Unpacking Bioshock 1. Andrew Ryan's idea of rapture was to make a secular, laissez-faire capitalist city with minimal government, virtually staying out of everything but individual rights, to prevent coercion and violence to one another. A city free from the usual political ideals, rejecting altruistic, socialistic, communistic forms of government, etc. A city that would contain captains and leaders of industry and the elites of art, the best of the best. A refuge, a utopia, where they are free from the burden of having to sacrifice their own interests and happiness for the many, left to do whatever they want, so long as it's not at the expense of others.
On the surface, the parasite expects the doctor to heal them for free, the farmer to feed them out of charity. How little they differ from the pervert who prowls the streets looking for a victim he can ravish for his grotesque amusement. What is the difference between a man and a parasite? A man builds, a parasite asks, where is my share? A man creates, a parasite says, what will the neighbors think? A man invents, a parasite says, watch out or you might tread on the toes of God.
This type of philosophy may sound familiar. Why? Because it's exactly the sort of city Ayn Rand thinks is best. Andrew Ryan is essentially meant to be Ayn Rand, or heavily influenced by her. Ken Levine, the creator, wanted to make a city that is based on Ayn Rand's idea of an ideal society, as a way of showing and critiquing it, a sort of experiment if you will, to show that eventually this utopia is not what it is cut out to be. His main idea was that you would slowly see why it does not work. As you near each boss battle, you come across voxophones which gives the villain context and a backstory. Ken would describe each boss battle as another nail in the coffin to why Ayn Rand's utopia would not work, a sort of blow or series of blows to her philosophy. So that leads to our next question. Who is Ayn Rand? Ayn Rand is a well-known philosopher and author of a few splendid books. The one book that really ties into Bioshock 1 is Atlas Shrugged. Andrew Ryan, like Ayn Rand, was a Jew during the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks came and destroyed his family, destroyed everything in his life, but the point is they both hated communism after the negative experiences of it. One of the recurring questions in this book is, who is John Galt? And if you haven't read the book, Wikipedia has a nice quick synopsis to this character. Galt is acknowledged to be a philosopher and inventor. He believes in the power and glory of the human mind and the right of the individual to use their mind solely for themselves. He serves as a highly individualist counterpoint to the collectivist social and economic structure depicted in the novel. In simpler words, he opposes the oppressive bureaucratic government in the book who would often implement socialistic or nationalistic laws at the expense of the leaders of industry, effectively preventing them from benefiting from the fruits of their own labour and inventions. And if John Galt sounds familiar to Ayn Rand's philosophy, then that's because Ayn Rand's books usually promulgate her theories, so it is worthwhile looking at her theory of objectivism to truly understand Bioshock 1. Ayn Rand posited a philosophical theory on how one ought to live their life, a philosophy based on objective reality, the idea that there is an objective absolute, and that men's minds and reasons are his means of perceiving it, and that man needs rational morality.
Here in the United States, perhaps the most challenging and unusual new philosophy has been forged by a novelist, Ayn Rand. Miss Rand's point of view is still comparatively unknown in America, but if it ever did take hold, it would revolutionize our lives. And Ayn, to begin with, I wonder if I can ask you to capsulize, I know this is difficult, can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute. That man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it. And that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith.
On faith?
Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason. A morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
All right, all right.
Now, may I define what my morality is?
All right.
Because this is merely an introduction. My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute, by which I mean that he has to hold reason as his only guide to action, and that he must live by the independent judgment of his own mind, that his highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness, and that he must not force other people nor accept their right to force him, that each man must live as an end in himself.
You put this philosophy to work in your novel Atlas Shrugged.
That's right.
You demonstrate it in human terms in your novel Atlas Shrugged. And let me start by quoting from a review of this novel Atlas Shrugged that appeared in Newsweek. It said that you are out to destroy almost every edifice in the contemporary American way of life, our Judeo-Christian religion, our modified government-regulated capitalism, our rule by the majority will. Other reviews have said that you scorn churches and the concept of God. Are these accurate criticisms?
Yes, I agree with the facts, but not the institutions. I'm challenging the moral code of altruism, the precept that man's moral duty is to live for others, that man must sacrifice himself to others, which is the present-day morality.
Yes, what is self-sacrifice? You say that you do not like the altruism by which we live. You like a certain kind of Ayn Randist selfishness.
I would say that I don't like is too weak a word. I consider it evil. And self-sacrifice is the precept that man needs to serve others in order to justify his existence, that his moral duty is to serve others. That is what most people believe today.
Well, yes.
But that is what, in fact, makes man a sacrificial animal. That man must work for others, concern himself with others, or be responsible for them. That is the role of a sacrificial object. I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself.
According to Ayn Rand, the purpose of one should be to pursue their rational self-interest, essentially to be reasonably selfish. Her theory was controversial as it often caused vehement opposition as left-wing and nationalistic policies were being implemented at the time. She often felt that one should not sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of others. So one important feature of Ayn Rand's philosophy is laissez-faire capitalism. We see this being largely present in Bioshock 1. In advocating laissez-faire capitalism, objectivism opposes the politics of conservatism, such as the notion that we are our brother's keepers and therefore must sacrificially serve strangers. The notion that successful businessmen should be regulated or coerced, at least to some extent, for the sake of the little guy, as if the so-called little guy cannot succeed in life by his own rational thinking. The notion that students in government-run schools should be indoctrinated with intelligent design theories or be required to pray. The notion that scientists should be forbidden to engage in embryonic stem cell research, while men, women, and children suffer from agonizing diseases that might otherwise be cured, and that those suffering from such diseases should be forced to live when they desperately want to die. The notion that homosexuals should be prohibited from experiencing the joy of sex, and the notion that America's military should sacrificially spread freedom, much less democracy. So you can see that objectivists would advocate for a laissez-faire capitalist society that's very much different to the Western one that we have at the moment. But moving on. Ken shows that laissez-faire capitalism presupposes that all kinds of advancements are good for society. Hence, the game's use of Adam, a DNA rewriting consumable that enhances its users, giving them certain abilities and powers. Adam was untouched and unregulated economically, and instead, in the end, it proved instrumental in the demise of the city, as people were getting addicted, out of control, and power-hungry with it. But it was interesting to see how Ken would use Adam to show how laissez-faire capitalism wouldn't work under such conditions.
There has been tremendous pressure to regulate this plasmid business. There have been side effects, blindness, insanity, death. But what use is our ideology if it is not tested? The market does not respond like an infant, shrieking at the first sign of displeasure. The market is patient, and we must be too.
It is a rejection to the objectivist assertion that all kinds of scientific advancements are beneficial to society, showing how one kind of advancement upsets the conditions for an equal society. But objectivism is really important because that is what Rapture is built on. Rapture is the digital homage to John Galt's Gulch. And if you're wondering what John Galt's Gulch is, in the book Atlas Shrugged, it's a refuge for the leaders of the mind or industry, the elites, the inventors, because in the book, the inventors and leaders of industry keep on disappearing mysteriously to go to John Galt's Gulch. And in the book, the reason why the leaders, the elites, and the captains of industry go to the refuge is because they get fed up with the previous government and having to sacrifice their own happiness, their own reasonable self-interest for the sake of the many. Andrew Ryan, much like Ayn Rand, was against an increasingly bureaucratic, regulating and controlling government. They felt that it would often get in the way of leaders of industry and the inventors and the elite. They both experienced communism and other political/governing models and felt the need to make their own refuge for such people to be free from all that.
To build a city at the bottom of the sea, insanity. But where else could we be free from the clutching hand of the parasites? Where else could we build an economy that they would not try to control, a society that they would not try to destroy? It was not impossible to build Rapture at the bottom of the sea. It was impossible to build it anywhere else. I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide. Any man who tells you different either has his hand in your pocket or a pistol to your neck.
So that leads to the next question. Why did Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand disagree with altruism, religion, and other moralities that encourages self-sacrifice for others, particularly strangers? Because they felt that it was moral to be egoistic. By that, Ayn Rand means where you do things for something, not just doing it because it is deemed good to self-sacrifice. They hated the idea that you would sacrifice your own happiness for others for lack of a good reason. I mean, if you genuinely want to do it, Ayn Rand wouldn't have a problem with it, but if you do it just to merely sacrifice yourself, they would brand you as stupid. But the most interesting question and the most interesting dilemma in the very first Bioshock was the demise of Rapture. It falls into a civil war, and that leads to the next question. So what went wrong in Rapture? Well, that depends really on your own opinion, but let's take a look at what the game says about it. It's one of the most fascinating things about the story and the world it was set in. Some gamers would say that Andrew Ryan and his governing body failed to apply Rand's principles properly. Later on in the game, we learn that Andrew starts to become increasingly regulating and controlling, something he built Rapture in order to avoid. Ken Levine would create the game in a way that illustrates how the city of Rapture could never sustain its ideals, because when objectivism is applied to characters that reflect actual human behaviors, namely greed and desire, a power struggle is inevitable. Ken would later on in the trilogy show how any ideal taken to extremes would cave in on itself, but more on that later. But let's pick apart what contributed to the downfall of Rapture. 1. Class distinctions. Despite building a city where elites and desirous people were left to pursue their own rational self-interest and enjoy a laissez-faire capitalist society which welcomes all kinds of advancement, a working class of characters emerge. They end up fixing leaks, growing food, performing manual labor, as well as other necessary yet menial tasks. The working class ends up resenting those higher up for obvious reasons. I mean, nobody wants to be scrubbing toilets and shit. That is where Frank Fontaine comes into the equation, exploiting the resentment of the newly established working class, eventually using their resentment to band them together, unite them, and wage war with Andrew Ryan. Fontaine's followers eventually become splicers or pawns used to further his agenda, but Fontaine demonstrated an understanding of a flaw within the objectivist utopian ideal.
These sad saps. They come to Rapture thinking they're gonna be captains of industry. But they all forget that somebody's gotta scrub the toilets. What an angle they gave me. I hand these mugs a cot and a bowl of soup, and they give me their lives. Who needs an army when I got Fontaine's Home for the Poor?
The highlighted flaw in that utopia shows that although objectivist theory would disprove from the exploitation of others, it still happens or has to happen. So let us turn to the other issues that prevented the utopia from working. The idea that we have free will. Does an individual have free will in Bioshock? And if you're asking why I'm asking that just in the context of Bioshock, that is because Bioshock is based on the objectivist utopian ideal. So let's take a look at it. As already established earlier, objectivists claim that people have free will because reality is an objective absolute, but the game shows this is not the case, as you have plasmids that alter the perception of reality of other people. Hence why you use enrage, hypnotize, and decoy to alter enemy splicers' sense of reality, so that they are easier to kill. If there is no free will, then there is no objective reality, as your perception of reality is provided for you.
Dr. Suchong, frankly, I'm shocked by your proposal. If we were to modify the structure of our commercial plasmid line as you propose, to have them make the user vulnerable to mental suggestion through pheromones, would we not be able to effectively control the actions of the citizens of Rapture? Free will is the cornerstone of this city. The thought of sacrificing it is abhorrent
However, we are indeed in a time of war. If Atlas and his bandits have their way, will they not turn us into slaves? And what will become of free will then? Desperate times call for desperate measures.
But the most salient example of you not having free will was when Andrew Ryan dies by your hand. After finding out that you were just an obedient slave with the sole purpose of following commands that would have "would you kindly" in it, profoundly, right after Andrew's death, the atmosphere gets a bit laudably comical. After you carry out the command to kill Andrew Ryan, Fontaine simply just gives you another command, which you nonchalantly carry out as if the previous 10 minutes didn't happen.
Hurry now! Grab Ryan's genetic key! Now would you kindly put it in that goddamn machine?
It was a tongue-in-cheek way for Ken to say, look, all you're doing is whatever I am telling you to do through the narrative.
Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run! Stop! Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
The game is making the point that you do not have free will, and if you think you do, it is illusory, as you are bound by the direction of the game and narrative. Hence the iconic line from Andrew Ryan, pointing out the difference between man and slave.
Was a man sent to kill, or a slave? A man chooses. A slave obeys.
Every time you hit him with the club, you reinforce that message.
Kill! A man chooses! A slave obeys! Obey!
Objectivism is of the belief that governments should only be agents of restraining and combating the use of force. Its actions have to be rigidly defined, delimited and circumscribed. No touch of whim or caprice should be permitted in its performance. It should be an impersonal robot with the laws as its only motive power. Steinman, a member of the governing body, eventually descends into madness, failing to be that impersonal robot, as he would maim and deform his patients in an effort to stand out from routinely making everyone perfect and aesthetically beautiful.
What can I do with this one, Aphrodite? She won't stay still! I want to make them beautiful, but they always turn out wrong! That was too fat! This was too tall! This was too symmetrical! And now, what's this goddess? An intruder! He's ugly! 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 Ugly!
So the standard of government called for by Andrew and Rand is allegedly impossible according to Ken. Can people really be trusted to be impersonal robots? The other thing that contributed to the objectivist utopia falling apart was isolation. Rapture was to be isolated from the outside world. So it appears that attempting to isolate Rapture from the world prohibit trade and all forms of communication also contributed to its downfall. People were murdered for violating the prohibition rules and for trying to smuggle in contraband from the outside, primarily because the elite or chosen that would usually come to Rapture would come from pre-existing ideals and systems. Therefore, they would bring with them experiences, knowledge, and expectations of the past. Perhaps this too halted Rapture from being the true utopia it aimed to be, a utopia divorced from anything above the surface. But perhaps Ken is being too extreme in his critique, because an understanding or an awareness of a need for a Randian utopia comes from the experiences of other models, so I'm not too sure about this bit. But despite its philosophical conundrum, Rapture was a beautiful city, boasting an extremely delightful soundtrack that has songs from the early to mid 1900s. The game invited the player into a philosophical journey, made a critique of objectivism accessible to a gamer. It expanded my knowledge and made me look into something more. But let us move on to my favourite Bioshocks of all time, and that is Bioshock Infinite. I preferred Bioshock Infinite primarily because of the companion element of the game. It literally felt like Elizabeth was travelling with you. She was painstakingly designed to be lifelike. Even if you put the pad down and go AFK, she would look at things, make observations and statements, and engage with stuff. It did not feel like a lonely journey Bioshock was. You felt like there was the same person with you. Mid-combat, she would toss you ammo or offer to unlock doors for you. The other thing that was amazing was that your character was not a mute, and instead actually talked and had a personality this time round in Bioshock Infinite, something that the first two did not have. However, this installment was very similar to other Bioshocks, but at the same time, very different. This was no accident. It tied into what the game was slowly building up to, and good God was it mind-blowing. It provided an explanation for all Bioshocks, but more on this later. The game starts with you at sea, going into a seemingly similar lighthouse, to then get ejected into the air rather than being submerged, to make your ascension to the beautiful and jaw-dropping Columbia, where you are serenaded with that out-of-tune piano. To then go into the church, which has a song that plays throughout various parts of the game and hint at the whole story's conundrum. Will the circle be unbroken? What I loved about Infinite so much was that everything was in plain sight, but you do not connect the dots until you beat it and revisit it on another playthrough. The song, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, alludes to the overall aim, to break the cycle, to undo everything that Booker does to Elizabeth. Much like Bioshock 1, Columbia is assumed as a utopian ideal, but it is not based on Rand's objectivism this time round. The alleged utopia here is based on American exceptionalism. Zachary Comstock is meant to resemble the American political figure Anthony Comstock. Historically, Anthony Comstock had a feud with Anna Goldman, which is portrayed in the game as anarchist Daisy Fitzroy. But like the first Bioshock, some of its main characters are based on real-life historical figures. And if you're asking who Anthony Comstock is, well, this guy is the creme de la creme when it comes to being a Buzz Killington. This man would purport to do things in the name of morality, but he ended up censoring a lot of sexual stuff when he enshrined the Act for Suppression of Trade in and circulation of obscene literature and articles for immoral use, aka Comstock laws, because no one can be fucking asked to say that again. Anyways, he wanted to regulate public morality, attacking, seizing and raiding whatever they could to make what they thought was a more pure society, morally speaking. Depriving people from contraceptives, sexual or STD information, confiscating shitload of books, pictures and pornography, anything to do with sex and vice basically. So that leads to the next question. If the utopian ideal this time round is based on American exceptionalism, what on earth is American exceptionalism? American exceptionalism has been historically referred to as the belief that the United States differs qualitatively from other developed nations because of its national credo, historical evolution, or distinctive political and religious institutions. The difference is often expressed in American circles as some categorical superiority. However, the term can also be used in a negative sense by critics of American policies to refer to willful nationalistic ignorance of faults committed by the American government, which makes sense as exceptionalism incorporates the idea that America had to be populated by exceptional and chosen people that were above the rest of the world. They would use that as justification to exterminate the indigenous people of the land, example Native Americans, to pave the way for Christian settlers. They were either forcibly removed or exterminated. That also explains why we see slavery and the abuse of the Chinese in the game. Historically, the Chinese were mainly the people that made America's railway systems. Once again, the game has its story based on our actual history, a game that is not afraid to show you the tension and difficulties of how things were, and how oftentimes it did not make sense. Unlike before, the game has a quantum mechanics element to it, which has driven fans crazy with unanswered questions, including myself. Towards the end, you see the game attempting to explain all other Bioshocks that were or could have been. A sea of lighthouses and a man, constants and variables, an allusion to the many worlds interpretation theory which branches off string theory in physics or quantum mechanics. The idea that in one world a Booker accepts the baptism and he is reborn as Comstock, doing what he does to steal Anna from Booker by way of a tear. The one that refrains from the baptism becomes Booker, heavy with guilt, gambling and a drinking problem, who would have Anna taken away from him by Comstock with the help of the Lutesses, who make a tear connecting the worlds together temporarily. When Anna would be taken away, her finger gets caught and snipped off in the tear, and that is why she gains the ability to open up tears. It has something to do with quantum entanglement, but I'm not going to go on to it here. Ergo, a circle is made, in which these events keep unfolding. You are not the first Booker to attempt to get the girl and wipe away the debt. Some have died trying, some have gone astray, some have led the Vox Populi resistance. Which Booker will you turn out to be? One that has already happened, or has their fate sealed? Or will you be different? You go into different timelines and worlds, and you get to see different outcomes. The different timelines so far suggesting that no matter what, the circle never gets broken and you always fail.
Wasn't the torture that broke me? Wasn't the indoctrination? It was time. Time rots everything, Booker. Even hope.
I was coming.
Songbird. He always stops you.
Yes, but I would find a way.
No. It's too late for me. I brought you here for your sake. Yours and hers. Here.
What is this?
However, the most poignant and beautiful part for me that really hit me like a slug in the chest was the ending. The ending was very tragic and upsetting for me. Booker was vehement in undoing what he does to Elizabeth. Elizabeth is your companion throughout most of the game. You feel a connectedness with her, like you both went through quite a journey together. Then at the very end, you both realize that Comstock is you and you are Comstock, existing in all possible states. Irrelevant what you decide, you must be snuffed out in the crib.
Booker, wake up. This is where it started.
I sold you. I sold you.
To your credit, you did try to weasel out of the deal.
This is all Comstock's fault. What if I went back? Killed him before he did any of this?
Things get set in motion.
How would one know how far back to go?
That's the only way to do it. Go back to when he was born, and I'll smother the son of a bitch in his crib.
In one instance, you accepted the baptism and became him. In the other, you decided not to. The point in time just before you make a decision, that is where all bookers must die for the circle to be broken, to undo everything and stop Comstock from happening / being in existence ever. And that is the moment where a deep tragedy occurs, as this meant Elizabeth would end up sacrificing herself to never have existed, to fix the timeline. You realize this, and Booker does not even resist getting drowned. He knows it needs to be done. He surrenders himself, agreeing with what Elizabeth is doing. He allows his lungs to fill with water, and the same out-of-tune piano that hits you at the beginning plays. I teared up like a little bitch. Then you sadly see all Elizabeths fade away, one by one, as the circle appears to be broken. Comstock never existed, neither did Elizabeth, as she was snuffed out in the crib as well. Then post-credits, the game tortuously shows a Booker checking up on Anna, the camera fading out just before he opens the door fully. The question of whether Anna is there in the crib in the corrected timeline is left in the dark. Very ambiguous and thought-provoking ending, but it was extremely frustrating to not have that certainty. I found myself feeling very sad and uncomfortable about the sacrifice and cost of attempting to undo everything. I also felt disturbed to think, what if it never worked? It meant the loop would just keep going, and you were just another instance in which it failed. One Elizabeth does not fade away before the camera fades away from the wounded knee scene, but as you know, the 2 DLCs later, one Elizabeth is still around as she does what she does in Burial at Sea Part 1 and Part 2. I spent quite a bit of time debating the ending, but in a recent Rolling Stone interview with Ken Levine, it looks like he let slip whether or not the circle was broken. He says, I quote, Elizabeth is the character I invented who does sacrifice herself to break the cycle. But even if worst case scenario my fears came true, the many worlds theory also suggests that there is a world in which Booker lives with Anna happily ever after, especially now that the timelines have been fixed thanks to Elizabeth and the Lutesses and Booker. But if the circle was broken finally this time round, that means that Booker will never see the Elizabeth that he got to know prior to the timelines being fixed. And that's quite sad, because you still have lost Elizabeth, who I would say is quite distinct from Anna. But to wrap it up, Bioshock was a game that made me think, that never shied away from big topics that people spend their lives working on. A game that had a bold vision, made by a creator that had the balls to venture into the areas that few game developers have the courage to do so nowadays. Bioshock will be a game to always remember. They say a good writer shows and never tells, and from Bioshock 1 and Bioshock Infinite, I always felt that was the case, particularly in Infinite. You're not being expressly and clearly told what the ending is. In fact, it leaves it open to debate, and it leaves you with a thirst of wanting to know what happened, or at least engage in some sort of discussion to try and pick away at it. Bioshock for me was a game that I'll always obsess about, and even when I finish it, and it's been years since I finished in Infinite on the last gen of consoles, it's a game that I'm always going to rank highly, and I think it's a game that's well ahead of its time. And it's a shame to see Ken Levine and Irrational Games step away from the big budget AAA versions of a game like this. In fact, they're scaling back and making smaller or medium-sized projects on this. And so the tragic thing about this is not that the game's bad. The game is very good, and I have very little bad things to say about it. But it's the fact that we're not going to see games like this for a while. And I just hope that this is not the last of this type of game. And I'm going to end the video there. There are many things I missed. Bioshock is a very big game, and it covers quite a broad range of things. If there's any doubts or questions or anything you're not sure about, feel free to ask in the comments below. We're very active in responding to comments. And thank you very much for giving your time and enjoying this video. And I hope you enjoyed it. And be sure to subscribe, like, or comment. And hopefully I can entertain you more. God bless.
You can picture happy gatherings round the fireside. think of tearful partings when they left.